World War II transforms Philadelphia into America's arsenal. After a decade of depression, more than 2 million residents dream of a better tomorrow.
The Second World War changes the scale of life at every level. Everything's bigger, noisier, more. And so the amount of activity on the streets, in transportation, in the port, at the airport, is just exploding.
We're making ships, we're making steel, we're making chemicals, making anything that's relevant to the war effort. 1 out of $6 spent by the federal government during World War II is spent in Philadelphia.
From row house to row house, Philadelphians embrace sacrifice and determination, and also newfound opportunities.
One of the things that the war produces in the city is this vast demand for labor, a kind of suspension of the old rules. Women are introduced into the industrial workplace, and African Americans are introduced into the industrial workplace.
The workers rely on a massive network of streetcars and subways to reach their jobs at defense plants across the city. But at the Philadelphia Transportation Company, the PTC, the job of trolley operator is for whites only.
You have black guys who worked. You have black guys that were in the war, who fought for this country, but the PTC would keep them in the menial jobs of being cleaners or mechanics. And that was a dirty deal.
A young civil rights leader, Carolyn Davenport Moore, rallies 7,000 Philadelphians in a push for equal opportunity.
My mother was very motivated to achieve justice for people, plain and simple.
We're dying in Europe and we're dying in Asia for a type of freedom that needs to be made real on the streets of Philadelphia.
Moore's protest draws national attention, and the Roosevelt administration intervenes, ordering the PTC to promote 8 black workers to be trolley drivers.
Whites and the union were furious that opportunities would be given to African Americans. And they said, no way would that ever happen.
In August 1944, with fighting intensifying overseas, more than 6,000 white PTC workers defy the federal order. They strike, shutting down the system, bringing war production to a halt.
At a very critical point, Franklin Roosevelt looks up one day and everything has stopped because someone has said, I won't work with somebody else.
The Roosevelt administration sent a general in. They sent troops in to run the trains. And they said, anybody who doesn't turn up for work can show up at their draft office on Monday, and we'll be sure that you get a nice placement somewhere in the South Pacific. The strike didn't last very long.
The federal threat and military presence end the strike. Carolyn Moore's coalition, reformers from all corners of the city, wins the first civil rights battle of a new era. As the war ends, GIs of all stripes return to a changing city. But the GIs themselves are changed. Having crushed fascism, many come home confident that they can shape the future.
We had a very important population returning from the Second World War. These are people that were going to go back to school. They were going to get started on families and they were going to raise them.
But they find a city dominated by a corrupt political machine. In power for over 7 decades, Philadelphia's Republicans control every facet of the city's life.
The graft and corruption went through all levels and all organizations of the city. The police force up for sale, embezzlement in city offices. You played the game or you didn't get the jobs.
It was the ward leaders. Their main offices were in the neighborhoods. They might be at a bar, it might be at a law office, it might be out of their own homes. So there are plenty of ways that you could actually develop schemes where you could keep money.
When a party is in power for a long, long time, it is essentially able to write the rules that it lives by.
The problem is that if you start to vote Democratic at the local level, you actually start to vote against your own family very often. You have an uncle who might be working for, the streets department, someone else in the fire bureau. If they get kicked out, if they lose the election, they lose their jobs.
Had been building up for some years. There was a lot of corruption in the city government. There were 4 suicides of city officials who were afraid they were going to be caught.
The political pot has to get pretty stinky before the change comes. But on the other end, the organization against it has to be terrific.
A ninth-generation Philadelphian, Walter M. Phillips, recruits a diverse group of liberal reformers, union members, civil rights activists, and business elite.
He had 80 people on the City Policy Committee, the Bureau of Municipal Research, Citizens Council and City Planning. These are all the creations of my father. He became really, through these committees, the author, the architect, the director of the reform movement.
There was an exciting, dynamic coalition who came together to make the city live up to its democratic promise.
Phillips' coalition puts its weight behind 2 war veterans, Joseph Clark and Richardson Dilworth, to run on the Democratic ticket for city treasurer and controller.
They were very different people. Clark was the cold intellectual, and Dilworth was the emotional, hot-tempered heart and spirit of the place.
As candidates, they attract the support of young professionals, including a group of visionary women who reinvent the modern political campaign.
They were pioneers, active day to day, on the street, organizing nonstop, and they were 24/7 people.
We invented the street corner rally, at which we went around on a sound truck, and some of the troops and the organization, the independents, would turn out rather enthusiastic crowds.
Natalie Sachs would be organizing on the street. Elise Balin was one of the key strategists.
Ada Lewis created something that she called psychological political warfare. She got into the heads of her opponents.
They broadcast their message over a new medium, television.
Emily Jones put together a series of 15-minute programs for TV.
The theme was, let's sweep the bad guys out, and used a broom.
They win in 1949, and 2 years later, on November 6, 1951, voters elect Joseph Clark as the city's first Democratic mayor since 1872. Richardson Dilworth will be district attorney. In that same election, voters approve a new city charter to bring professional management to City Hall and root out corruption.
Clark was tough against the bosses. Dilworth is more of a pragmatist, and he recognized that you got to give these guys something. And Clark said, no, I'm going to give them nothing.
The old patronage system was gone. The pay-to-play was gone.
In its place, a system for merit hiring and promotion. And for the first time in an American city government, safeguards for racial equality in employment.
If you came into Philadelphia to the City Hall, grand symbol of the city's municipal pride, be covered in soot. Soot from all those factories. That soot made the city filthy, unhealthy. On top of that, for nearly 20 years, almost nothing's been built here.
It had the relics of its grand industrial era that, in the eyes of many, were an encumbrance to Philadelphia becoming a modern, consumer-oriented downtown. The question of what's to be done about making a new Philadelphia was on everyone's mind in the immediate post-war period.
Walter Phillips recruits an ambitious young city planner, Ed Bacon. Together, they conceive a vision for modernizing the city. On display at the Better Philadelphia exhibition.
The better, not the greatest, not the best, but just the better Philadelphia. It was within your grasp.
Ed was salesman, visionary, planner, very good at dealing with rich decision makers and firing them up.
Better Philadelphia captivates the city's imagination. 400,000 people pack Gimbel's department store to see their city of the future.
It had a model, which was the centerpiece of the entire exhibit. The switches were pulled, and the model would flip over, and a new Philadelphia would appear, and that was spectacular.
Just think what you could have. You could have this shining city, these skyscrapers, blue sky and sun.
The exhibition includes Bacon's plan for a network of highways that will open the new downtown to suburbanites and their cars.
What planners didn't seem to recognize was that a road that makes it easy to get into the city makes it just as easy to leave.
Change is in the air. In South Philadelphia, still the most crowded part of the city, the rhythms of daily life are changing.
If you lived in South Philadelphia and you played half-ball in the street and then went to the luncheonette, you would go in, drop 25 cents into the jukebox, and if you heard something that you liked, all the guys would go outside of the luncheonette and start to harmonize to that song that they heard on the jukebox.
We had no place to go, no money to spend. And all the guys hung on. Of course, sometimes I'd bring my guitar there and would sing and play for like an hour or two. For nothing, for fun. It was the joy of the music.
Growing up in South Philadelphia, there were moments of racial tension, to be sure, but it was more interracial interaction and interethnic interaction than a lot of people think.
You walked out of your front door there and you had everybody. We all got together and we all just had fun and played games in the streets. You knew that something was special about it.
I think it was something kind of spiritual about South Philadelphia. There was just so much music around, and there was so much appreciation for music.
A few miles up Broad Street in North Philadelphia, where jazz and after-hours clubs carry the night, disc jockey Georgie Woods, the guy with the goods, promotes a new sound, rock and roll.
Kids were listening to radio, WHAT and WDAS.
And after school, they're watching Bandstand, the WFIL TV show that goes national on ABC in 1957 with Dick Clark as its host.
When I went on, it created that flow of more fans and more fans. And I became a teen idol.
That was it. I mean, that's coast to coast, 5 days a week. How are you going to beat that?
It was the hottest show ever in Philadelphia. Imagine watching in Nebraska, seeing these kids from the streets, jitterbugging, dancing. I mean, wow.
But at the same time, there was always a contradiction. Rock and roll emerged out of African-American music. Dick Clark commodified it, and he created a program that was very safe for white advertisers to support. African Americans were excluded.
The policy keeps the show's sponsors happy, but it also reinforces all the old lines of segregation. Black and white kids may be listening to the same music, but as the 50s come to an end, their worlds are growing further apart. The cultural gap between black and white intensifies as the city's core industrial economy disintegrates.
One of the great ironies of the great migration of African Americans was that just as they moved into cities like Philadelphia, the industrial jobs were starting to disappear.
The paths have crossed, so to speak. Textiles moving south, and those large factories closed. Where do I go?
For City Planning Director Ed Bacon, the industrial collapse demands a fundamental redesign of the city.
We are continually thinking of the city as a whole and preparing comprehensive plans for its future development. And we are working, of course, in the restoration of the older blighted sections of Central City.
The notion that you could fight back the industrial filth and create a livable city, that's a path-breaking notion.
Bacon's first target is the so-called Chinese Wall of Pennsylvania Railroad tracks that divide downtown. Removing it opens up acres of prime real estate and paves the way for Penn Center, Center City's first new development in 30 years.
This was an idea that people shook their heads at and said, who's going to do this? This was private property. And there was little interest in taking on the Pennsylvania Railroad, one of the biggest corporations in the world. No, nobody could believe it.
Bacon negotiates relentlessly with the railroad, making design compromises along the way. And by 1960, a new Center City rises on the footprint of the old rail yard. With political reform advancing, Mayor Clark decides to run for the U.S. Senate. Clark's longtime ally, Richardson Dilworth, picks up the mantle and wins election as the city's next mayor, vowing to rebuild the city and its neighborhoods.
Dilworth and Clark believe it's their responsibility to expand the rights that were promised during the New Deal. Rights to equal opportunity, rights to decent housing.
My father truly believed that you are your brother's keeper. And he talked about politics as something that was worthwhile, as something that was a grand thing to do.
Last year saw dreams become fact. New projects, buildings, highways, and bridges were completed, and still more are being planned.
He was a pioneer in rebuilding cities. There were always fights about doing that because whenever you want to do something that's new and different, you are going to have fights.
Dilworth gets behind Bacon's plan to redevelop the tough, run-down neighborhood around the Dock Street produce market into a model of urban renewal to be called Society Hill.
Society Hill showed that you could do urban renewal without wholesale bulldozer clearance, that you could actually salvage this collection of 19th century federal-era homes.
But conflict erupts between planners who see the neighborhood as blighted and longtime residents who are adamant to protect their way of life.
There were dynamic communities of black people, working class white folk who lived in those areas who were, in short, pushed out.
The communities that get obliterated take away a sense that nobody cares about them, that they're in the way, they're expendable.
Dilworth continues the push for renewal. But in 1962, he resigns as mayor to launch a campaign for governor. City Council President James H.J. Tate, a street-smart politician from Hunting Park, takes over, sworn in as the city and nation struggle with increasing racial and economic tension.
Civil rights leaders look to the booming new construction funded by the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, and they see mostly white faces.
The Black church is the institution in the African American community. So you have the leaders of the church saying, what can we do? And particularly Reverend Leon Sullivan saying, we can develop jobs, we can develop businesses.
We're adding a new dimension to the civil rights effort. And whereas before we were just protesting, now we're going to protest and repair.
Sullivan is the pastor of Zion Baptist Church in North Philadelphia, a preacher of self-help and community empowerment.
We called Leon Sullivan the Lion of Zion. He was a man who had an enormous amount of compassion and understanding that change had to come.
His strategy at the time was to find out where the jobs are. And he went to major companies in Philadelphia and said, you can see that something's happening in this community. It's being burned down. People are angry. I need you. He was rebuffed.
Civil rights activists in Philadelphia get together and say, we need to do what they're doing down south in our own backyard. And they march on City Hall. They occupy Mayor James Tate's office, demonstrate at the site of a new school that's being constructed in Strawberry Mansion, and they demand that those jobs be open to African Americans.
We're out there on a picket line, and we're burning, trying to get this equality for us in the North.
What Reverend Sullivan then did, he went back to 400 ministers who would become his army of protesters, if you will. Then said to them, I want you to preach every Sunday morning, not to buy goods and services for these companies who have refused to at least open up the doors of opportunity.
We won't buy from Tastykake, we won't buy from Coca-Cola, we won't buy from Sun Oil until those companies open up and hire African Americans.
Sullivan's boycott opens up some jobs, but neither self-help nor federal aid can stem the poverty and suffering in North Philadelphia. On the streets, anger builds.
One of the areas of the greatest tension in Philadelphia was between the city's predominantly white police force and its rapidly growing African American population.
People were getting tired of what the policemen were doing, walking into clubs, locking up people, knocking people down.
After 20 years of frustration, a new NAACP leader issues a call to action.
I don't intend to overcome. That means I got to beg for it and get equal. I want to be superior, so I want to say we shall overrun.
The message said, we have proven ourselves. We've proven ourselves in any number of wars. We've proven ourselves in the labor market. Where does it end?
In August of 1964, a routine arrest led to rumors spreading like wildfire in North Philadelphia that it had gone bad.
The word in the streets was that a pregnant black woman had been shot and killed. That was not true, but the Columbia Avenue corridor exploded.
The unrest swells into a riot. Police Commissioner Howard Leary instructs his officers to holster their guns and avoid confrontation. Leary's young deputy is Frank Rizzo, a popular law and order cop from South Philly. Rizzo seethes with outrage over Leary's strategy. He has his own ideas. Leon Sullivan preaches calm, hoping to convince rioters that violence will only backfire. He's joined by the popular DJ Georgie Woods and NAACP head Cecil B. Moore.
Those three, they calmed things down, and that was something that was kindling to happen some way, shape, or form in Philadelphia.
The riot lasts 3 days. Hundreds of injuries. Police and community trust broken. Dozens of stores and restaurants destroyed. Most will never open again.
The riot was a symbol of two sides of clashing Philadelphia in the 1960s. On one side, African Americans, alienated by the police, concentrated in isolated neighborhoods that were undergoing economic decline. On the other hand, defenders of law and order and white ethnic Philadelphians that wanted to put down those uprisings by any means necessary.
Just blocks from Columbia Avenue at Connie Mack Stadium, many Philadelphians pin their hopes on their baseball team. The Phillies, a perennial loser, spend the summer of '64 in first place. But in late September, the team falls apart, losing 10 games in a row and missing a shot at their first championship. A collapse unprecedented in baseball history and a defining blow to a generation of Philadelphians. Jobs and residents continue to flee. But that same year, Time magazine features Edmund Bacon on its cover, praising Philadelphia's far-reaching urban renewal programs. And across the sprawling city, old alliances break and new powers rise, giving voice to the aspirations of average citizens and expanding the foundations for a better Philadelphia.